So, today we're going to be talking about witches. So, witches have quite a bad reputation today and it has quite a sad history. And I believe this conversation is quite an emotional one, but very important. And it's really a conversation about learning to respect other people's beliefs by simply getting to know each other. There's so much you don't know about the world, and often just through a conversation, you can truly expand your mindsets and maybe learn to be a bit kinder. So, I'm just thinking about the stereotype today where we see them in films like The Wizard of Oz, for example, The Witch of the West, and Hansel and Gretel, and various other fairy tales. I think people tend to think about them as being kind of real beings, where truthfully it's a stereotype, it's really a creature based upon a real truth and a real belief and a real background. So, yeah, hope you guys like this conversation. It's quite an interesting one, and just a lesson to be a bit kinder to each other by simply educating yourself and learning about each other. There's so many wonderful beliefs out there. Hello, welcome back to Paranormal Perspectives, and we're on episode 8 already. My name's Kieran Mace, and my friends call me Stan, and we have my lovely friend Christine here, and Siobhàn. Hi guys, how you doing? Happy Halloween.
Hiya.
Happy
Good to
Halloween.
see you.
Good to see you. Yeah, thanks for being here. So, yeah, tonight's going to be quite an interesting one. So, we're going to talk about the world of witches. So, witches tend to kind of fall under different stereotypes, different expectations. Sort of as a society, we've kind of almost accepted them as being a certain way, and yet, it's kind of seen as a bit offensive for other religions and beliefs to be treated a certain way. Yet, witches tend to be kind of characterized in a certain way that's kind of acceptable, and it's not always really very fair. So, yeah, it'd be kind of nice to speak to you guys about sort of the history of that and just your stories around that. So, passing this over to you guys.
Okay, so what was life like for people living in England between the periods of 1450 and up to the 16 and the 1700s? And why is that relevant to the witch hunts? Of course, this era is really complicated, and it's far too complicated for us to delve into too deeply. So what I'd like to do is just loosely paint a picture of events so that the viewers can build a bit of a backdrop, and it will take us to the zenith of when the witch hunts were on the go. So we're going to start around 1430 to 1418. We're going to talk about Europe and England as one, and they were suffering what was known as the Great Slump. So that's a bullion shortage. So there's no gold or silver to mint coins, which is essential just to keep the trade and everything ticking over. In England, by 1450, we're in recession. Unemployment's high, especially in the cities and the bigger towns, and the weather is literally all over the place. Springs and autumns are bringing intense rain, storms, and severe flooding. The winters are bringing cold snaps that are so cold the rivers are freezing, and even in some parts the sea is beginning to freeze. And summer is bringing extreme heat waves that are bringing droughts and famine, and of course the inevitable deaths. Henry VI is on the throne, and he is a totally disastrously incompetent king, and he's surrounded by just corruption on every level and everywhere that you can look. England and France at this point are going through the death throes from the 100 Years' War, with England losing bit by bit all the territories that they once owned in France and Normandy. The English crown, and therefore the country and the populace, is in deep financial doo-doo. Henry VI has an annual revenue of about £60,000 a year, which today would be about £37 million. But he's in debt for £400,000, which today would be about 250 million. So the books are not quite adding up. For everyday life, for the likes of me and you, it wasn't great. Taxes were high, crime was rife, and life was really hard, especially if you were in the poorer sectors of society. People were really not happy. Earlier in the year of 1450, 2 bishops and the most hated Duke of Suffolk had been killed by angry mobs. By the spring, a guy called Jack Cade led an army out of Kent up to London, and they were revolting against the corruption of the crown and the abuse of powers that had filtered its way down into local governments. The revolt turns into a riot, as they often do, and it was squashed very quickly, as they often are. But what happened is that it inspired other people, and for years afterwards, pockets of revolts sprung up across the country. The everyday people weren't the only people that were grumbling. The nobles were grumbling loudly. They were not happy about the loss of their French lands and the revenues that brought to them. They were arguing amongst themselves, and this was resulting in feuds, power struggles, and discord. By the summer of 1553, England had lost everything that they owned in France, apart from Calais. And probably because of this, Henry VI, the King of England, from the July of 1453 to December 1454, descended into what is being called a catatonic stupor. Throughout this period, he was completely unresponsive, and absolutely nothing that anybody tried to do would bring him out of it. He did, obviously, around Christmas time, come back to reality, but he then suffered a further 2 relapses in the spring and autumn of 1455. This was kind of, they tried to keep it really quiet, but the truth is that he never really fully recovered what was already a fragile state of mind. In today's world, he'd be diagnosed and receive some treatment, but he was a medieval king, and medieval kings were expected to be both mentally and physically fit to be able to rule and to keep their nobles in order. The fact that he couldn't do that, and the fact that he wasn't doing that, had catastrophic consequences. It plunged the country into a further 20 years of civil war, which is better known as the War of the Roses or the Cousins' War. By 1485, it was all changed all over again. It's out with the old and in with the new. When Richard III lost the battle at Bosworth, it's the end of the medieval period. He's the last medieval king that ever led his men in charge onto a battlefield. The Tudors were very much ensconced now on the throne, and Henry VII was a very different animal to what had come before him. So we'd done away with the medieval warrior king that's leading his men into battle, and the domestic wars had stopped because the houses of York and Lancaster had united under Henry VII. So without the foreign wars and without the domestic wars, the vacuum was filled with the chaos of religious reform. This was sweeping all across Europe, and it was starting to creep into England around this time. If we fast forward from Henry VII and we go to his son, Henry VIII, and we're around about 1536 or something like that now. We're going into the English Reformation. And again, this has got another catastrophic effect on the everyday people that lived in the country at the time. The monasteries and the abbeys that Henry VIII was doing away with were not, on the whole, operating closed-door policies. They were places that offered opportunities to people that lived in the area. They offered employment. They were hospitals. It was where you could get some kind of healing from. They would offer alms, and, of course, they would be offering spiritual support as well. When the Reformation came and all that was gone, nothing was put in place to replace that. So people were kind of just left adrift, especially if you were in the more rural areas. So, essentially and hypothetically, if you look at it that way, you could be losing your job, you could be losing your home, you could be losing your healthcare system, you could be losing any kinds of practical support that you might need, on top of the fact that you could be losing your spiritual support at the same time, and you're just meant to get on with it. So towards the end of Henry VIII's reign, we see that the Protestants are on the rise. Now, the Protestants were once a secret sect. The fact that they spoke against the Catholic Church and they didn't agree with the Catholic Church made them heretics, and they were guilty of heresy. And heresy is a really important point throughout this. Heresy was punishable by death, and they had to be very careful of what they're doing. But as we go out of Henry VIII's reign and we go into his son's reign, he's a Protestant, but he's also a child, and he's being ruled by regents. He dies at 13, and then Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish wife of Henry, the first wife of Henry VIII, who's a staunch Catholic, or was a staunch Catholic, their daughter now comes on the throne, Mary, and she's a Catholic. She's on the throne, and I believe that there was about at least 200 plus Protestant martyrs that were killed under her regime. They were burnt at the stake, a lot of them in Oxford. So now she goes, and we get Elizabeth I that's come onto the throne, and she's a Protestant. So we've got this pendulum that's kind of going on of, yeah, you're right now it's wrong, now it's right, now it's wrong. Elizabeth I, though there were religious, what's the word I'm looking for? Persecutions. There were still the religious persecutions going on under Elizabeth I. But on the whole, she was of a mind that if you paid lip service to it and you pretended, they would leave you alone. If you didn't, then obviously they'd come looking for you. The trouble with Elizabeth I is that she was on the throne for a very long time, and she was unmarried, and she didn't have any children. So when she died, we're plunged into a succession crisis, and there's only one place that it can go to, and that's to her. Was he her nephew, Chris? Yeah, that's to. So that's Mary Queen of Scots' son. Elizabeth I had Mary Queen of Scots beheaded. Now the throne of England and Scotland is going to her son. And he would be the first Stuart king that sat on the English throne. And Chris is going to tell us all about this nice Stuart king, and with the ideas that he brought from Scotland down to England.
So thanks, Siobhàn. So into this melee of unrest comes James VI of Scotland, or better known to most of us as King James I of England. What do we know about him? He was, of course, the son of Mary Queen of Scots, who was murdered by the English crown. His father, Lord Dudley, also murdered, and his wife, the Scottish Queen Mary, was heavily implicated into that. Although it was never proven, historians will argue strongly that she had a hand in it. We have, therefore, a young child who was less than a year old when he saw his mother for the last time. At 13 months old, a crown was put on his head, and he was crowned the King of Scots in Stirling. His childhood was frequently troubled by the power struggles among the nobles, who, seeing the young child, sought control and influence over him. He was a highly intelligent boy, and he received a rigorous academic education from his tutor, George Buchanan, who by all accounts harboured a deep hatred for his mother, Mary Queen of Scots, and he was very vocal about his disdain for her. Contemporary accounts also indicate that Buchanan regularly beat the young king for minor mistakes in his schoolwork. Here we have a king rising who is all too familiar with violence. He's likely experienced trauma from the abuse that he personally suffered. He has no parental guidance and struggles to discern who he can trust. This is a ruler who also has the freedom to act on whatever desire he wants. And that paints a portrait of a potentially damaged individual whose background could shape his reign in profound ways. September 1589, Anne of Denmark is married to James VI of Scotland via proxy, and she sets sail for Scotland to meet her new husband and take her place next to him on the Scottish throne. But the weather had other ideas. It was dreadful. Fierce storms damaged her ship and she was forced to anchor in Norway for repairs. A second attempt to sail was made, but her ship once again sprung a leak and returned to Norway. Back in Scotland, chomping at the bit, James was unhappy when he heard the news and was unwilling to wait that long to see his new bride. He made the decision to go to Norway himself to fetch his queen, and due to bad weather, he ended up staying several months with her both in Norway and in Denmark. He then returned to Scotland with Anne, a journey that was ultimately successful. However, they were battered by storms for the entire journey back. The circumstances of Anne's failed journey and his time spent in Denmark seemed to ignite James's obsession with witchcraft. In Denmark, witches were blamed for the storms, and it was a trial held in Copenhagen in 1590 which resulted in the execution of the accused women. This wasn't unusual in Denmark. There had been a number of witch trials in the country during the 16th century, but somehow it affected James. In Scotland at that time, witchcraft was against the law, although it mostly went unpunished, really, being seen as a normal criminal activity. But when James arrived back in Scotland with Anne and heard the news of Denmark's witch trials, he began his own witch hunt. He became totally convinced that witches had tried to kill him and his queen by calling up the strong storms that he and his bride had encountered whilst returning to Scotland. There was a witch trial held, which were about 70 people were involved, and one of the accused was a wise woman named Agnes Sampson. She was tortured badly, and she confessed to things that were I'll quote, miraculous and strange. Allegedly, she also whispered to the king, telling him the words that he and Anne had spoken to each other on their wedding night. This convinced him that she must have been in cahoots with the devil, and he said, and I quote, believed all the devils in hell could not have discovered what they had said to each other. So she was eventually killed. James explained that it was mostly women who were witches, as they were frailer than man is, and so were more easily entrapped or ensnared into the snares of the devil. To support this, he used the Bible to support his arguments for witchcraft as being plainly prohibited, and he referenced Exodus 22:18, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." The only acceptable punishment, therefore, for a convinced witch was death. In 1597, he released Demonology, a treaty against witchcraft. Demonology laid out information such as how to identify a witch and how to punish them. The fear of witches among the population took hold. Large-scale witch trials took place in Scotland, and an estimated 3,000 people, most of them being women, were accused and killed. It was said that James would visit the accused in prison and take part in sadistic beatings of these poor women. He also enjoyed watching them burn. Historians have argued quite strongly for him being some sort of sexual sadist as well. Under the union of Scottish and English crowns in 1603, James's ideas on witchcraft migrated south into his new kingdom of England. The influence of the monarch's viewpoint played a pivotal role in legitimizing the work of the hideous Witchfinders in England, as we shall see.
So there are more Witchfinders than we'd like to imagine, but we're going to concentrate on the most infamous one, and that's Matthew Hopkins. So who was Matthew Hopkins? Well, he was an opportunistic nobody that very much wanted to be a somebody, and for a very short period of time during the mid-1600s, his wish was granted. Next to nothing is known about his early life. We know that he was born in Great Wenham in a small village in Suffolk around 1690, and he was one of 6 children. He was the son of a Puritan vicar called James Hopkins, who served as the vicar for St. John's Church in Great Wenham. So Hopkins' early years may remain a mystery, but what we can say was we know that he was educated. His formative years were governed by growing up under a strict Puritan household and an environment. If the vicar's Puritan, then it stands to reason to say that the congregation are Puritans as well. The king sitting on the throne is James I of England, and he's possibly the most intelligent yet stupid of all the kings that have ever graced the English throne. As Chris has already mentioned, James is somewhat obsessed with witches and witchcraft to the extent that he wrote a book. Precedents had been set long before Hopkins had even been born. First, there were the Scottish witch trials, and in England, we then have the Northampton witch trials, which consisted of 5 people, both men and women, who were hanged at Abington Gallows on the 22nd of July in 1612. The following month, in the August, we have the more notorious witch trials, the Pendle witch trials, which took place in Lancashire. This is the world that Hopkins was born into. This is the world that he grew up in, and this is the world that shapes the thinking of a man as he enters into early adulthood. By 1644, Hopkins had made his way to Manningtree, which is about 10 miles away from where he grew up. He had an inheritance of £66, 13 shillings and 4 pence, which is around about £8,000 today. And his intentions were to elevate himself up to being a gentleman. And in order to do this, he planned on buying a business, or he did buy a business, the Thorn Inn at Mistley. It was during this time that Hopkins met up with a guy called John Stern. Now, John Stern was already a gentleman landowner, and he was 10 years of Hopkins' senior, but they were both very much of the same mind. It was Stern and not Hopkins who first accused a group of Manningtree women of witchcraft, and it was Stern who appointed Matthew Hopkins as his assistant, and Matthew Hopkins was only too happy to jump onto the witch-finding bandwagon. He soon set about finding evidence of witchcraft among the women that Stern had accused, and to find that evidence he had to torture them, not in a medieval sense, so let's forget the screw thumbs or the racks. What he used were surprisingly quite modern methods. The accused were often stripped naked and their bodies would be shaved. Women, employees of Hopkins and Stern, known as seekers, would then intimately search the accused bodies for what they were looking for, what they called witch marks or devil marks. And in reality, that could be anything. That could be a mole, it could be a skin tag, it could be a birthmark, a slight defect. As long as they said that they were the devil's mark, that was enough for Hopkins and Stern, and then they could next move on to the next level of the gathering of evidence that these are indeed witches. And the next level is called the pricking. So the same women, or different women, who knows, now became the prickers, and they would use needles, knives and bodkins to prick their victims to see if they reacted or to see if they bled. And this is based on the belief that all witches bore a devil's mark, but that mark could feel no pain, nor could it bleed. So hollow wooden handles have been found with retractable blades, and they're all from this area, which gives the appearance that the accused witch's flesh could be penetrated to the hilt with the knife that's retracting back in, and it's not leaving any marks, and of course there's no bleeding. There are other specifically designed needles that have been found, and one end is sharp and the other end is blunt. So perhaps via a quick sleight of hand in a gloomy room with some terrified people, the sharp end can be used on normal flesh, thus bringing forth pain and blood, whilst the dull end is used on the witch's skin, and again it's not breaking the skin and it's not causing any pain, which means she's a witch. Other torture methods were also used: sleep deprivation, sitting in stress positions where they were forced to stand in various unnatural pose positions, or squatting rooms for hours on end. There was food and water deprivation. They were also watched for hours at a time by either one of the two Witchfinders, Hopkins and Stern. Other methods involved walking, so that meant literally walking the accused to the point of exhaustion, and then rest is offered for a signed or a full confession. And then, of course, comes the most famous method of all, the ducking stools. The chairs were formerly used as a punishment for disorderly women, scolds, as we were called back in the day, and sometimes unscrupulous tradesmen. Let me just scroll. The ducking stool was a form of women pine, which meant women's punishments, and they were instruments of public humiliation and censure, and they were used for offences of scolding, backbiting, and less often they could be used for sexual offences such as giving birth to illegitimate children and prostitution. So ducking stools were used in the earlier parts of the witch trials, but they were quickly abandoned as the method of ducking, or the swimming test as it's known, evolved. And what they started doing is the accused's right thumb is then bound to her big left toe, and a rope is tied around her waist. She's then thrown into a deep body of water. If she floats, she's a witch. And if she survives that ordeal, she would then be hanged. And if she sinks, she's proven that she's innocent, but the chances are that she's already dead. So after Manningtree, Hopkins and Stern, accompanied by their merry bands of women seekers and prickers, were travelling all over the eastern counties of England, claiming to be officially commissioned by Parliament to uncover and prosecute the witches. The truth is they had absolutely no official status, and any paperwork that they were carrying was probably nothing more than safe travel passes that were both common and essential when a country was at war with itself. The title Witchfinder General, as Hopkins is infamously known, is a title that he gave to himself, which might give you a little bit of an idea about him. And they were earning vast amounts of money. Hopkins himself is believed to have said that he took 20 shillings a town plus his travel expenses. Well, 20 shillings is about £100 plus in today's money. And Stowmarket have got records that show that their costs charged to the town were £23, which is equivalent to about £2,500 in today's money. The cost that Hopkins and Stern were levying was so high that in 1645 a special local tax had to be levied in Ipswich in order to pay them. At Bury St Edmunds in 1645, via their instigation and then their investigation, a band of 18 women were executed by hanging. A 3-week court adjournment had to happen at this time because there was an advancing King's army. And once that threat passed, the second sitting of the court carried on, which resulted in another 68 condemnations. There are unconfirmed reports of mass executions that took place, with anything up to 60 to 70 witches being killed. Hopkins and his colleague, John Stern, sent more accused people to be hanged for witchcraft than any other witchcraft finder in the last 160 years. They were solely responsible for the increase in the witchcraft trials during those years. How many they were accused, we'll never really know, and it's believed that at least 100 innocent people lost their lives because of these guys. they had a reign of terror that went on unchecked for 14 months. And why? How? We ask ourselves. Well, mainly there's a real belief in witchcraft, and there's a real fear about witchcraft, and also where they were. So they're in the east of England, which was a parliamentarian stronghold. Nothing's going on over here. There are all eyes and minds are looking elsewhere at events that are unfolding in other parts of the country, and they're just allowed to run around and do exactly what they wanted to do. However, storm clouds are gathering, and that's because of what happens at Bury St Edmunds, and better minds had started to notice and ask questions. And I'm going to pass you back to Chris now, and she's going to tell us all about those people and those better minds.
So we can only imagine those poor accused. They didn't stand a chance. Once somebody shouted, "You're a witch," it just took hold. They had no defense, and the way they were tortured, that was it. It really grits my... But anyway, let's get back to it. Thankfully, amongst all this madness, there existed greater minds that had great misgivings about the whole witch hunt debacle. One of these was John Gall, who was an English Puritan cleric. He was well educated, receiving degrees from both Oxford and Cambridge, and he lived in Huntingdonshire and was well aware of Matthew Hopkins. Gall clashed with and preached against the self-appointed witch hunter, and in 1646 produced a pamphlet in which he objected to the cruel swimming test that Siobhàn mentioned earlier for witches used by Hopkins and Stern throughout their reign of terror. Whilst he believed witchcraft existed, Gall took a legalistic and evidentiary approach to witchcraft and argued for stringent standards of evidence. There were others too who had misgivings, but probably the greatest influence came from a man called Sir John Holt. He's actually a hero of mine. Sir John Holt attended Oriel College in Oxford. He entered Gray's Inn about 1660, where apparently he applied himself with exemplary diligence to the study of law. He was called to the bar in 1663. He was a supporter of civil and religious liberty. He distinguished himself in state trials by the manner in which he supported and defended the pleas of the defendants, a rare thing back in those days. He was appointed Lord Chief Justice and was therefore someone who was looked up to, respected, and listened to. He did not believe that witches existed, and he presided over 20 trials that resulted in the acquittal of all the defendants. He employed creative and practical ways around statute books in order to prevent the execution of witches. And I quote, "He skillfully combining directions to jurymen that permitted religious faith and even the law's acceptance of the validity of witch belief with measures to seek acquittals through raising the question of reasonable doubt. If reasonable doubt existed, you cannot convict. And the unmasking of fraudulent cases of possession. Very often when somebody shouted witch, when it got to court, they would act up as if they were possessed by the person that was in the dock. And of course, it was all very theatrical. And at the end of one trial that he presided over, of Sarah Mordike, she was accused of witchcraft by Richard Hathaway. We don't know what she did to upset him. But anyway, Holt acquitted and ruled that Mordike's fees should be paid by Hathaway and that he should be arrested and imprisoned on charges of perjury for bringing false accusations about Mordike and for pretending to be bewitched. So there were two trials, one in 1701 and one in 1702, and it registered highly significant verdicts in the history of witch persecution, as they registered respectively not just the acquittal of an accused witch, but the prosecution and punishment of her persecutor. as a deterrent to others who might have been tempted to levy similar charges in the future. So from that, other judges began to notice and started to examine witch trials more closely. While Hope was not the only skeptic, he was the most influential just because of who he was, and is often cited as a highly honourable figure in the history of English witchcraft. As time went on, the witch hunters faded away, and potential accusers became more hesitant to shout witch, recognising the possible consequences of their actions. The increase in literacy and the spread of more rational thinking, combined with various reforms and laws, ultimately brought an end to the madness of the witch hunts. Nevertheless, the term witch continues to be used as an insult even to this day. The Witchcraft Act of 1735 remained in effect in this country until the 20th century. In November 1941, Helen Duncan, a Scottish medium, held a séance in Portsmouth, during which she claimed that HMS Barham, a warship, had been sunk. This statement gained significant attention because the sinking of the ship was not announced publicly until 1942. As a result of the attention her claims attracted, she was watched and she was followed and she was reported to the police. Duncan was finally arrested and charged, and in 1944 she was convicted under the 1735 Witchcraft Act. She is often referred to as the last witch in England. So, these poor people, on this Halloween night, let us take a moment just to reflect and to extend our love and support to all who suffered and died as a result of accusations of witchcraft throughout many centuries. They became scapegoats for the ills of society, falsely accused and tragically losing their lives due to dishonesty, greed, jealousy, ignorance, and the superstitions that preyed on the fears of those around them. Their stories remind us of the importance of compassion, tolerance, and understanding in our world. Thank you for listening. Happy Halloween.
So I'd like to just take a moment to let you guys know that I've launched a book, my first book. Over the last few episodes of the Paranormal Perspectives podcast, I've had such fortune to meet some amazing people, and as ever, it's a reminder that the most amazing things happen to the most normal people. And the more we talk about these things, the more we can learn from each other, the more that we can expand our understanding of the universe. So this book essentially is a selection of ghost stories. These are experiences that I've experienced firsthand, some theories around them, maybe a bit of humour in there too. But the book isn't just simply about scaring people, it's really about opening people's minds, essentially, that, again, like I say, the most amazing things happen to the most normal people. So hope you don't mind taking a look if you have the time, and let me know what you think. I'll post a link in the comments. Thanks, guys. Enjoy the episode. Yeah, I almost felt myself like welling up a bit there as well. No, because it's kind of redolent, and it's redolent of the times, but also links very closely to the world in which we live in today, like the modern world, because there are so many things happening at the moment where there are wars where certain cultures are kind of being eliminated ultimately, and even thinking back to the 40s of the experiences then, the same thing happened. Yet, these kind of situations have been happening, over hundreds of years. Yet, for some reason, this one in particular, has lasted. It's like, okay, well, we agreed at some point in history that this is wrong, but yet it's still okay to make fun of witches, and it's even like as part of our culture now. Like for Halloween, for example, people walk about dressed as like the classic vision of a witch, like. You think about in the media about like the Wizard of Oz, for example, about the fairy tale of Hansel and Gretel, like it always being like the witch is the bad character, like it looks bad and scary and threatening. For some reason, we still just accept that. Yet other beliefs, like nowadays, I think we're beginning to move into a more tolerant age. Maybe not as much as I want to, but more beliefs are being accepted and respected in the workplace, as well as non-beliefs, and that's okay. But again, this one still sticks. This one, a good majority of the population, I'd hazard to say, really, don't even know witches do actually exist because they're Wiccans. They go by other names too. So my first question to you both really is simply why? So why were they picked on so much? And I know you touched on the fact they've been scapegoats and also used as an example really for knowing things that they shouldn't know. But why do you think they thought it was okay to do that and to treat them in that way?
For me, society has always got to have scapegoat. If you look back through history, you'll see there are scapegoats throughout, whether they be Jewish people, whether they be witches, whether they be Doberman pincers, whatever it is, we need to put blame somewhere because it's our way of dealing with not being able to deal with stuff outside of our control. So we focus on things that we can. And I think it's just a human condition to, when Siobhàn was saying about the prickers and the seekers, those women that were doing that job were probably likely thinking, I'll do that job, then they're not going to look at me as being a witch. Because it must have been terrifying, Kieran, to be living your life and you turn your eye the wrong way, and it's witch. What do you can't go back from that. Somebody's made that accusation. And of course, we find that very often they were women that were alone, that were old. I mean, it wasn't just women. It was men, and sometimes, sadly, it was children as well. But it was people that could be bullied, basically, And of course, there was the thing about there was political things going on there as well, where I think at one time, or maybe all the time, if a witch had land, if she owned land, if she was killed because she was a witch, all of that went to the state. Or people profited from witches dying. So I think there's more than one reason, but they all seem to coalesce. And like we tried to show, what was going on in society, you've got the monarch saying, "Yep, that's all right." You've got the legitimization. It just takes some people to go, "Hold on a minute." I don't think we'll ever get to the psychological roots of why we need scapegoats, but they were scapegoats.
Yeah, so often it's like I think about the expression passing the buck. Basically, it's like, okay, well, usually people will point the finger. The finger should be pointed back at them because often it's a deflection of guilt. So it's either guilt or gain. From my experience, that tends to be the reason why people are.
It takes a brave person to put their hand up and say, "This is me, and this is what I believe in," and that's it. Whether we agree with those beliefs or not, they'll skirt around it or go around the houses, or they'll try and hide bits or cover up other little bits that they perhaps think that you might not agree with, so they won't be that open about it. And that's human nature, isn't it? They like to. I think people like to fit in, and if I think there's a natural fear of anything that they don't understand, so they fear it. You know what I mean? And I think that it's just a natural part of that horribleness that are in humans. I'm sorry, but as you rightly said, there are wars going on, and there have been wars going on since the dawning of time. And that's all down to man, wanting something from somebody, or an area where somebody is. They want something from there, so they've got to go, or we've got to do this to get something. Yeah. And that's just human nature. That's just the really nitty-gritty of the horrible side of what humans can be, isn't it?
Yeah, that's ultimately, it's on the other side of enlightenment, really. So there are people that kind of use the scapegoats and all sorts, and you have the finger pointing, okay, you're a witch, and so on. It's the same as, like, so I mentioned previously, like previous episodes, about the misnomer of the word paranormal, and it's just a barrier we put up for what we don't know and don't understand and we're afraid of. So we say that's paranormal though, so it's probably magic, so I don't understand it. I need to kind of keep away from that, and I won't explore further beyond those bounds. And sometimes there are certain beliefs that are they're almost misnomers for maybe it's not a misnomer for the way they want to kind of name themselves, though, but a misnomer in terms of, okay, we'll put that bad word, for example, in this case, it's a witch. That's the barrier drawn. We're gonna almost give it a nickname in a way. It's just the word witch, and that's the barrier that can't be crossed. Anybody that crosses that barrier is seen as evil, is seen as threatening and such. Yet beyond what a witch actually is, there's just another belief to know.
Witches weren't any of those things, were they, originally? I mean, we'll use the word witch because, we haven't got another word to use, really. But they were just your healers. They were the people that you've got tummy ache, you've got toothache, you don't want to get pregnant, blah, blah, blah. You do want to get pregnant. You fancy the fella down the road and you need a love potion, you know what I mean, that you'd run off to. And they'd give you some herbs and perhaps a lot of it was psychosomatic and things like that, and perhaps some of it wasn't. I think what's happening, and we've touched on this here, I think the era of the witch trials is what's happening is that we've got a real renting of the old and the new, and there's a chaotic struggle because people don't quite know what to do. They're so used to doing all this, what they've been doing for hundreds of years, but now they're kind of being pushed to do this, and they want to do it, but it's kind of like this. And I think that kind of leads almost up to a kind of a bit of mixing and a bit of mumbo jumbo going on. Most of the people are illiterate, so they're kind of forming their own conclusions, which they still do today. They're forming their own conclusions without educating themselves of any facts, you know what I mean, sort of thing. But I think that the thing and how they got away with it and why it happened was that literal rinse from the old to the new. There was confusion. These women were once the norm. They were accepted, and then all of a sudden they become unnormal and unacceptable because modernity and the charge towards it has told them, no, you can't do that. That's not normal. You know what I mean? Now you've got to go to the shop and pay for it.
Yeah, so how about we? My suggestion is at this point in this conversation, like I've absolutely loved hearing all of this anyway, and I think it's just such a wonderful thing that we actually put this on the internet, really, because you've both spoken about the past of witches, about the very sad things they've all went through, like the very much, it's a stain on humanity's history, really. So separating that, because that has ultimately become sort of, fossilized in time. It's become the stereotype that's never really fully broken. So separating the past away from this point and presenting as the present, like, what are witches really to anyone else out there who don't know anything about witches? What are witches in, the current day, basically? Like, what do they do? What are their beliefs? How do they connect with the world?
Right, okay. So I consider myself to be pagan, although I believe, I'm a spiritualist as well. But to me, they are pagans. They're of the earth. They, it's as simple as they, nature. The whole thing about the seasons. They're aware of that. They're in tune with that. They're they have this, like, tonight is Halloween. It's not. It's Samhain. It's Samhain to the pagan world. So it's all nature based, and it's working with nature rather than against nature. I've stood in ritual in circles, and I'm sure everybody's got all these ideas about us running around naked. Have you ever got naked on a November night in Britain? At my age? Yeah, I'd be dead. Yeah, I'm sure you will. But no, I think it's in people's imaginations, there's some lurid stuff going on. And to be fair, maybe that does. But I'll be honest, I've never witnessed it. I have, however, had some great nights, sat round with Wiccans, witches, shaman, all manner of pagans, and sat drumming and had the most wonderful experiences. And so I don't think you can pin them down and say this is what a witch does. I think all women are witches in the sense that they work with, they cook, they put their magic into cooking, they create. Men are also witches. I think we need to take that word and go, oh, we're just people.
I think, like, so the general populace, again, who are just looking at something kind of on the surface level, you've still got the old hag kind of witch, who incidentally arose from a good witch from the part of Switzerland many years prior to that. This is where we get this traditional hag witch from, but she was a really good witch. I think the actual modern day witches, I think they're pretty liberated people. I think they're quite happy. I think they're quite free, and they go about their business and do whatever it is they feel that they want to do. And I don't think that many of them really care what other people think. I think they just get on with it and are quite happy in their own little bubbles and their own little lives. I've never met, I'm not a witch myself. I couldn't call myself a Wiccan. I never would do and never am. But I've met some, and you wouldn't pick them out of a queue in Tesco's necessarily, you know what I mean? Most of them have got decent jobs, and they've got mortgages, and they pay bills, and they go to work, and they just lead normal lives. They just lead a more natural, kind of more natural based lifestyle as much as they possibly can. Yeah, so they're kind of chilled, and they like to be in tune with nature and things like that. Nothing negative. It can't be negative, can it?
No, if it comes from nature, usually it isn't anyway, and the intention's kind of good. But that's exactly the thing. It's almost like that's what I want to say to people out there is like, go and learn from people. Because I myself, I was raised Catholic, and nothing against Catholicism, as it has many good, it has bad about it too, but the world that I grew up in then was just that. That was the tiny little window that I saw the world, and the world was presented to me and described to me. These are the limits, these are the boundaries, this is the way you wanted to operate. The way that we want you to operate. And I was just miserable. I felt so limited. I felt like, but there must be something more to this, and it didn't feel real. It felt fake. But basically, it came a point in my life where I just began to look up things, Actually, it actually started with this conversation with the security guard. I was working at a popular DIY store back in the day when I was a kind of college student. And I felt so fed up and miserable and down. I had a really horrible time. I was just sat there at the till because I was kind of operating till, kind of scanning items and so on. The security guard used to stand near me to watch because it was quite a late night. And I started having a chat with him, and he was actually Hindu. And I thought, I actually really want to know what that's about. And kind of me and him were bored anyway. We used to kind of joke about it. I said, if it's okay, like, do you mind if I ask you about that? Because he was kind of wearing certain paraphernalia, and I thought, I want to ask about that. And when I asked him, like, his face lit up as if like no one had asked him that before. And I was thinking, but why hasn't anyone asked you that before? Which I then asked him. He says basically, I don't tend to kind of talk about my religion in this country, in Britain, because I don't tend to see a lot of me around, at least in the area that I live in. But he says, I haven't had any issues like being that way, but at the end of the day, I don't tend to kind of share it though. And but yeah, he taught me about his religion, about their belief in spirit, jinn, and just sort of the way they sort of perceived reality. And at that point, I thought this is actually really interesting. Like, almost got a taste for that. And then from that point, I just started to ask more questions. Like, I started meeting more people. Like, one person I met was a Wiccan years ago, and he taught me about his beliefs. It's very similar to kind of spiritualism, even paganism, I hate to say, but I know, Christine, you're more of an expert than that and me as well, because actually I would like to ask you more about paganism in the future. But then I learnt more about Judaism. I met an atheist one day as well. I wanted to know, like, the way they see the world. And, like, my mind just kept expanding and expanding. And from that point, I felt like I had less hate for the world, as in, like, I didn't hate everything when I was a Catholic, though, but I felt almost afraid, and fear does come from hate in some way or form. And it just came from simply asking questions. Like, you don't have to believe in what you research, but the fact that you're taking in more and more and more comparables, more information that you have, it kind of enriches you as a person. Even like, one last thing I was going to say is, when I went to Sri Lanka a few years ago, like, I'm so lucky to go to Sri Lanka, like, on a honeymoon as well. I met, it's a very kind of Buddhist kind of focused country. There's a lot of Hindus there as well. I thought the sweetest thing was, like, we visited this temple that was built into this rock face, and I believe it was a Buddhist temple. I'd been there for so long, and nearby there was quite a large Hindu community, and a few hundred years ago they invited their Hindu community to build a temple within their big cave of Buddhism so they could pray side by side. and they're two different religions with different beliefs. And it kind of humbled me to think that despite people having two completely different ways of seeing the world, they honoured each other enough to share that sacred space. And that to me made me realise there's so much more out there to learn from. So all this hate and BS around, witches or other different faiths and beliefs, all the hate comes from fear. Fear is kind of, bred from ignorance. And once we remove that ignorance, we become richer and better people, less warfaring, believe it or not. I know it's more complicated than that though, but the more we understand each other, the less we hate.
Misunderstanding comes understanding if you ask questions and you start to empathize and walk a few miles in somebody else's shoes, you know what I mean? So you start losing your isms or your preconceived ideas of what people are or what they should be. On the whole, most people are all the same, regardless of pretty much what era they came from, what colour skin they are, what religion they are. Most people just want to lead a quiet and happy life. And that's pretty much it, you know what I mean?
And can I just say happy Diwali, because of course we have the Hindu festival of Diwali, which is the Festival of Lights, and it was my privilege to be in India. First time I went to India at Diwali, and I had a wonderful time, and we were dragged in off the street and taken into a house where we were treated, and it was absolutely wonderful. So yeah, I think if anything comes out of this discussion that we've had tonight is to be more tolerant of other people, whatever they are. And perhaps that's where we should end it.
Oh, totally. I think that's just like a beautiful note to end on, really, because I feel like through the conversation, it's great to know. I mean, there's so much I've learned from both of you this evening about learning about the history of witches and what they've been through, and like
there were no witches. That was. I think that was one of the points we wanted to get across. There actually are no such things as witches. They were just normal people, everyday people that were caught up in this maelstrom of chaos and all that you've just talked about.
Yeah, and to not be associated with Wiccans essentially, because they're separate. Because the witch is the stereotype, isn't it? And Wiccan is the belief, the real belief. Is that correct?
No, but can we talk
it.
about that another time? I think I think we should end it there, and that's another discussion for another night because they're entirely different. So perhaps we should end on that.
I want to know more about this.
Happy
Diwali,
happy whatever.
Samhain, blessings to you and yours.
Yes, and Halloween.
It's a good time for you to make. Think of it as if you're preparing. This is kind of a Wiccan-y thing. So think of it as if you're preparing the ground for the next harvest. So it's a good time for you to plant the seeds of your wishes, desires, and ideas, so that you can water them throughout the winter and that they'll come to fruition when the sun comes back. So that's very Wiccan.
Will do. Yeah, well done, you two. Did a great job. So I'll end this there.
Thank you very
Speak
much,
to you in the next episode. Yes.
Thank you for
it's a
hosting
pleasure. Yeah,
us,
spread a bit of
Kieran.
love. Ciao, ciao. Bye.
Bye, everybody. Bye.